Dr. Ron Martinelli. I'm the CEO of Street Safe Defense Firearms Program, and welcome to the CCW portion of our training class. Now, hopefully, you've already gone through the PowerPoint that discusses all of the issues with the California CCW law, the Arizona CCW law, and the reciprocity agreement with 32 other states. I'm also going to be joined today by our co-host and instructor, Rob Eggers. Before we begin, let's just talk a little bit about what it would be like to be carrying a concealed weapon, not only in the state of California, Arizona, but in all the other states. Don't forget that carrying deadly force has awesome responsibilities associated with it. You literally have the power of instantaneous life or death. And this is a serious lifestyle. In fact, the lifestyle that I would suggest that you begin thinking about and even living is one like a police officer, with respect to how you carry your weapon and when, if ever, you would deploy it. Remember, always, it is better to be a good witness than have to use deadly force. Don't forget that any time you would use deadly force, it opens you to both criminal and civil prosecution. So, whenever you use deadly force or you consider using deadly force, and we'll talk about this, you have to have an objective reason to believe that you or the persons with you or another person are an imminent threat of great bodily injury or death. When you carry concealed, make sure that when you are with close friends or your spouse or your girlfriend or your kids, they know you're armed, and they also know what side you are carrying your weapon on. When you go into a restaurant, you will need to seat appropriately in a place where you can see the exits, you can see the cash register, and you have positions of cover that you could move to and positions of escape that you could move rapidly towards in case there is a deadly force threat against you. When you get out of your vehicle and when you're walking down the street as a pedestrian and you're carrying concealed, you need to scan in all directions to make sure that you have enough reactionary gap to guard against any potential threats. Not just imminent threats, but potential threats. Make sure that when you look at the PowerPoint presentation, you thoroughly review all the laws that deal with the use of deadly force and self-defense, specifically in the states of California and Arizona. So before we begin, let's talk about the experience of your instructors. I'll introduce myself, and when Rob comes forward, he'll introduce himself. I'm a retired police detective, 25 years on the job, and I have a tactical background in both undercover operations and special weapons and tactics. I'm a use of force instructor at all levels, including deadly force. I'm a member of the United States Department of Justice, where I am a forensic and law enforcement expert, and I've been a police practices and civilian use of force, deadly force expert in court, both state and federal, for about 29 years now.
Hello, my name is Rob Eggers, and I'm a member here at Street Safe. A little bit about my background. I started at the age of 19 in the state of Florida as a deputy sheriff. After about 2 years, I figured I wanted a little bit more of the world, so I joined the Marine Corps for 5. I have about 4 years of fugitive recovery experience, a ton of PSD experience, and I have 5 years as a training instructor, lead instructor for Seminole Tribal Reservations. My background is primarily for firearms defense. I did 5 years with the Air Marshals, and that's where I learned my trade after 9/11.
All right, so let's talk about self-defense. one of the most important things dealing with self-defense and the use of deadly force is understanding the difference between a subjective standard of proof and an objective standard of proof. The next thing is to understand the differences between predictive use of force and objective use of force. So let's talk about subjectivity versus objectivity, because these are two important standards of proof. Anytime that you would use force, specifically deadly force, the law requires that you use an objective standard in your calculus or decision making of whether or not to use force, especially deadly force. So let's start with subjectivity. Subjective standard of proof would be a educated guess, it would be a suspicion, or it would be speculation that is not necessarily supported by facts or forensic evidence. Okay? Let me give you a great example. If I had a teal colored shirt and I asked a group of people, what color is this shirt? The people might say, well, that's a blue shirt. Some people might say, well, it's a green shirt. Other people might say, well, it's a bluish green kind of shirt. And maybe we'd find somebody that says it's a teal colored shirt. So we've had 4 or 5 people, and each one of those people have given us a different answer as to what color that shirt is, because that's the color that they think or speculate that that shirt is. So don't forget, there is no forensic fact that supports any of the opinions of those people. So that's what speculation or a subjective standard is. Again, it's a suspicion, it's speculation, or it might even be a hunch or an educated guess. When you're using force, we can't use the subjective standard. On the other hand, if I held up a dark black shirt and I went back to those 5 people and I said, what color is this shirt? They would probably all say, well, that's a black shirt. But how would we really know that that shirt was black? Well, the shirt's got a label, and we'd open up the label on the back of the shirt neck, and it would say something like Model 350, 50/50 cotton polyester, black. That term black on that label would become a forensic fact. So do you understand the difference in our analogy between subjective and objective? So remember, in order to use force, especially deadly force, we have to have specific, articulable facts and circumstances that would lead a reasonably trained person to believe that the person that was the supposed assailant presented an imminent threat of great bodily harm or death. It doesn't always have to be death. It could be great bodily harm. And don't forget that that threat that is imminent, meaning occurring right now or just about to occur, has to be towards you, somebody with you, or a third person. Now let's talk about this second concept of predictive use of force versus the objective use of force. Okay, so you're at the gas station and you're pumping gas. And while you're pumping gas, a man approaches you aggressively and he has his hand inside his shirt. And he's got something that looks like a barrel that's pointing at you. And he says to you, "Give me all your money." And he says it very angrily towards you. And you look at the hand in the shirt and you look at this protrusion through the shirt and you pull out your gun and you shoot him. Okay? And as he falls down, there's nothing in his hands. And once the police arrived and he searched, he has no weapon at all. So the question to you would be, why did you shoot him? Well, I thought he had a gun. Well, let's talk about what types of things were subjective and predictive versus objective and forensic. Okay? Number one, he said, "Give me all your money." And he had his hand in his shirt like he had a gun, and I saw a protrusion through the shirt that looked like it was the barrel of the gun. But that's pretty much all you have, because you're thinking he had a gun. But what you don't have is an overt objective act, as if the person really did have a gun. So, because he didn't have a gun, there was no overt act. You never saw him pull a gun out of his shirt, and all you had was a feeling that he was armed and he was going to shoot you. That's what's referred to as predictive thinking. Now, let's use the same experience, but let's change some of the facts and circumstances. You're at the gas station and you're pumping gas, and a man aggressively approaches you, and he puts his hand in his shirt pocket, and he says to you, "Give me all your money or I'll blow your frickin' head off." And you're thinking, oh my God, this is an armed robbery. Now don't forget, you've got the shirt inside the pocket, you've got the barrel, which you think is a barrel, protruding through the pocket. But look at the difference of what you have now. This person threatened you by saying, if you don't give me all your money, I'm going to blow your frickin' head off. And now, as he starts to move, you see a dark and black object that you believe is a weapon. And now you shoot. And if you shot under those circumstances, you would have enough objective forensic evidence that supports your reasonable objective belief that this person was going to commit an armed robbery, and if he didn't get his money, could shoot and kill you. Do you see the difference? So let's talk about the law in California, Arizona, and in most of the other states that allow citizens to carry a handgun concealed on their person, okay, in public. So the things that we need in order to establish defensible self-defense are these criteria. Number one, intent. Is the intent to harm, is it verbalized or it's physical? Now remember, in our first example, okay, we had a verbalized intent to cause harm. Give me your money or I'll blow your frickin' head off. And number two, we had a physical manifestation that the person was armed, okay, as demonstrated by the handgun. Number two, does the person have the means to harm you? Well, in our case, he certainly does. He's got a weapon that you were able to articulate, seen coming out of the concealed pocket that he had. Number three, does he have an opportunity to harm you? In other words, will this gun, if it's fired, will it reach the target, which is you or someone else? Okay. The last thing is preclusion. What does preclusion mean? Well, that means that somehow, because of the circumstances or the environment, you're precluded or prevented or obstructed from doing something else, like escaping or using some other type of device or means or instrument to protect yourself. Now, don't forget, in California, in Arizona, and a lot of other states, we adhere to something referred to as the Castle Doctrine. What does that mean? That means you can stand your ground and you are not obligated to retreat. But that doesn't mean that it may not be prudent for you to retreat. So Rob and I would tell you, and all of our other instructors would say, that if you have an opportunity to escape harm, you want to consider that as your first line of defense. Remember, deadly force is a serious thing to use, and you should only use that when you are pretty much up against a wall and you have no other way to protect yourself or escape. Now let's talk about the concept of imminent harm versus potential harm. Okay? So we're back at our gas station again, and we've got our individual, and he approaches us and he says to us from a distance of maybe about 30 feet, okay? And let's say this guy's got a broomstick in his hand, okay? So maybe a homeless guy, you're pumping gas. From about 30 feet away, you see this guy approaching the gas pumps, and he's got a broomstick in his hand. And he says to you from afar, "Give me your money, give me $1, or I'm going to hit you over the head." Okay, from 30 feet, and don't forget, you're at the gas station, so you got your vehicle there, and you've got the gas pumps. So that would be potential harm, potential risk. Because if you just stayed still and didn't comply, you'd give that person an opportunity to close the gap of that 30 feet and assault you. Okay, but don't forget, you've got the car to use in obstruction. You've got the gas pumps to use as a physical instruction. You can do a lot of different things, and you could simply just leave your car there and you could run away. So you're not faced by preclusion. So all you have is a potential threat of harm. It wouldn't be a good idea to reach into your concealed carry and pull out that handgun and shoot that individual, okay? Because he only presents a potential threat of harm, and you're not precluded from escaping. You're not precluded from using the vehicle for cover or the gas pumps for cover, okay, or as an obstruction against that person. On the other hand, if that person approached you by surprise while you're pumping gas and he approaches you from behind, and all of a sudden you turn around and he says, "Give me your money or I'm going to knock your head off," and he's already raised up that pipe or that broomstick, it would be legally justified for you to pull your handgun and to fire in self-defense because he's right on top of you. That means the threat was imminent, the threat of great bodily harm or death. I don't think anybody would argue that a person with a broom handle or a 2x4 or a metal pipe couldn't cause serious bodily injury or perhaps even kill you under those circumstances. So let's talk about the reasonable person standard, because that's definitely going to come up into court, whether it's criminal court or civil court. The reasonable person standard or doctrine means that given certain prescribed circumstances, would a person that was reasonably trained, such as yourself, see the threat the same way and act the same way with respect to self-defense and deadly force? That's what the courts or the trier of fact, which could be a judge or a jury, has to consider. Those are actually the jury instructions to the jurors. Given all the facts of this case, would you believe that a reasonably trained armed citizen would see the threat the same way and react the same way? Now, conversely, if they wouldn't act the same way, then that would mean that the shooter would not have been acting with objective reasonableness. So if we go back to one of our first instances where we had the guy, the robber so to speak, with his hand inside his pocket and just showing some sort of protrusion, and you felt that you were in imminent harm, but there was no threat to shoot you or to harm you, just give me your money, and he had a hand in the pocket where you couldn't objectively articulate that that was a weapon, and you shot, then absent the forensic evidence and your predictive rather than objective thinking, that would not be seen as an objectively reasonable use of force. Conversely, going back to our second example, if you were the same person again and you were accosted by a guy that had his hand in his shirt where people normally conceal weapons, and you could see the protrusion of what appeared to be a gun barrel through that shirt, and the person yelled at you, "Give me all your money or I'll blow your frickin' head off," and then started to extract something that you could articulate looked like a gun, and you fired under those circumstances, and the jury saw all that evidence, and they decided that, you know what? I think if I were sitting in that man's shoes and I saw everything and heard everything that he did, especially when that assailant started to pull out that gun and he fired, I think that he was acting in an objectively reasonable manner. So that's what we're discussing and what we mean when we talk about an objective reasonableness standard or the reasonable person doctrine. So let's talk about not only the existence of danger or the threat, and now the diminishing of danger or the threat. So at first, we're posed by a threat. Let's go back to our fight between you and that guy that thought he took your parking place. Okay, so he's punched you, you've punched him, then he pulls out a knife, and you pull out your gun, but once he sees your gun, he turns around and starts moving away from you, and you draw your gun and you shoot that person. Okay? That would be ruled, more likely than not, as a non-justifiable use of deadly force. Let's talk about why. Now, the person, in fact, is armed with a knife, okay, and that could cause serious bodily injury or death. But here's how that scenario changes. Albeit he drew that knife and you drew your gun, when he saw your gun, he turned around and started to disengage away from you. So that means that the threat, although still potentially there, it's no longer imminent. And then you shot him in the back from a distance of 20 or 30 feet. When that threat had diminished, that would be seen as unreasonable force. Do you understand why? Because although there was initially a threat, that threat had diminished and the person was disengaging or retreating away from you. When you drew your gun on a retreating person, that turns you from potential victim into aggressor. And you never want to be on that side of the fight.
You know, Dr. Martinelli has already talked about reasonable standard, self-defense. Let's talk a little bit about home defense. One of the things that we always talk about is you never leave the outside to go in or inside to go out. In other words, if there's a door, if there's a barrier, you always wait for that person to breach that barrier. One of the things that's always questionable is a garage. We have several videos we're going to attach that shows an individual, the property owner, actually leaving into the garage because there is a door where the threat and initiates the threat to come in. In California, that's a no-go. Why? Because you actually let the threat in and you went to the threat. You made personal advances at that threat versus allowing that individual to breach to the inside where your family, it should be in a safe place. You should already be having your wife call the cops or whatever means you have. Use your personal cell phone that's always on us to begin with. That's one of the main differences. The second thing is, what about home defense anyways? We should never allow them in because we should take certain steps to defend our property. Alarms, cameras, your best friend, which is your dog. Obviously, all those things are ways to mitigate the circumstance of a potential lethal encounter. What else do we have? Say that individual actually comes through and they are armed and they're ready to shoot. What do we do? Where do we go? We should always have a plan in place at our home as to where we're going to put our family, how we're, if we can, to get to another safe haven, a lockdown room, or a way out. For instance, if they go through your front door and breach, and you have a 2-story, and upstairs you know your family goes to that one safe haven that has a stairwell down like mine does, that is a way to mitigate a potential shooting. Even though they breach, and yes, they are coming armed in the land, would you rather get in a shooting that has a 50-50 chance of winning or a $2 million lawsuit policy? Because in the state of California, even if you wound somebody what's inside of your residence, they can civilly and criminally be held civilly and criminally liable still. And a civil suit can hurt you just as much as any criminal liability.
So let's take this home defense thing a couple of steps farther. Rob has led you right down the road and given you some really good keys about planning and home defense. But let's talk about some scenarios. Let's say that it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're in bed with your wife, and all of a sudden you hear the smashing of glass and the breaking of wood, and you know in your mind that there's been a forcible entry into your home, and you and your wife are the only two people in that house. You go to your gun safe and you grab your gun, and the door between your bedroom and the outside hallway is shut. And now you've armed yourself, you've put your wife in a position of cover, you've taken a position of cover yourself, and now the person is trying to breach through the door. And you yell at that person, "Don't come in here, I'm armed, I'll shoot." And the person ignores that force warning and they breach that door, and as they come through that door, you can see they're holding a large crowbar. At that particular moment, it would be objectively reasonable for you to believe that that person, that intruder, that burglar, that home invader posed a imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death to you. Under those circumstances, you could shoot to defend yourself. Let's take a look at that same scenario and switch it up a little bit. Same thing, you and your wife, only two people in the house. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're sleeping, you hear the crashing through your front door, the shattering of glass, you hear somebody in your house. They're coming up to the door of the bedroom, which is again closed and locked. They're trying to breach through that door, and you yell out to that person, "I'm armed, I'll shoot, leave the house." And they continue to try to kick that door in. At that particular time, you believe that that intruder poses an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death to you and your wife, but you can't see that intruder, but you know that you and your wife are the only two people in the house. Under those circumstances, you can preemptively fire through that door without even seeing an armed threat, and that would be seen as objectively reasonable because of all the other forensic facts. It would also help, of course, is that once the police got there and they found that body, that he had some sort of weapon. But under those circumstances, it may not be required for you to use deadly force. And remember, it's always good to give a force warning. Now let's take a look at another circumstance where it's 3 o'clock in the morning and all of a sudden you hear a garbage can tip over and your dog starts barking, and you go to the back of your house because all the noise is coming from the back of your house. And you're inside your house, which is a barricaded position, and you're armed. And out in your backyard, you see an individual out there who you don't recognize, who's definitely trespassing on your property. And you yell out to that person, "Leave my property right now, we're calling the police, I'm armed and I'll defend this property." And the person sees a shovel laying in the backyard, and he picks up that shovel and he holds it over his head in a menacing fashion. And from a distance of 30 to 45 feet, you fire on that person and you shoot and kill him. Ask yourself this question: was that an objectively reasonable use of force? Well, I would tell you as an expert, I don't think so. And let me tell you why. Because the objective facts and evidence don't support a threat that is imminent of great bodily harm or death. Let's look at a couple of things environmentally, which are keys to any defense of imperfect self-defense. Number one, there's a distance of 30 to 45 feet between you and the assailant. Number two, and even greater, you're inside a barricaded position. You're inside your house. So you have the ability to call the police. Your wife can call the police. It's okay for you to hold that person at bay with your firearm in case he breaches through your house, but those overt acts merely indicate a potential threat and not an objectively reasonable imminent threat.
So let's talk about when and if you should ever brandish your weapon. Going over a scenario that's often asked is about females. When they're walking alone through a parking lot late at night, what do they feel? How do they feel secure? Obviously, there might be a disparity of force between a male that's a possible attacker and a female in itself, just based upon strength alone. But let's go back to the rules of intent. You're walking through late at night, everything's around, and you're walking to your car. You see a menacing individual dressed maybe in all black or whatever you just feel uncomfortable with. Can you legally display your firearm? Absolutely not. You have to take steps, hence IMOP. Intent, means, opportunity, and by preclusion. What can you do? You honestly don't know this individual's intent. He may be deaf. He may wear hearing aids and can't hear what you're saying. But what do you do first? Yell. There is no law against yelling, saying, "Step back, you're scaring me." What else can you do? You start running a zigzag pattern. I would never go straight to my car because you're putting yourself in a path of closed off confined space, especially if there's a car next to you in a parking lot, unless you could quickly engage into that car without him being able to trail you. But you want to know a little bit more of what's going on. So you run a zigzag pattern. He continues to close that gap. He just met possible means in engaging into the opportunity. The opportunity of, we don't know what he's going to do, but the thought is there, he's going to harm you. So when do you actually display? Intent's been closed, means have been closed, and opportunity's been closed. You've used your hand signals, your verbal, you've ran patterns. Now you can legally tell him, "Hey, I've got a gun. Stay away. You're scaring me again." And then if he continues to close the gap, that is the time that you can probably brandish. And you have to realize it's based upon the reasonable standard of the individuals on the jury. Put themselves in the same situation, and they'll probably go with the same line.
Now, when Rob was giving you those scenarios with regards to defensive display of a hand weapon, he mentioned a term referred to as disparity of force. Well, what does that mean, disparity of force? Well, Rob gave you a great example. Big guy, little guy, right? Big guy, small woman. But disparity of force could also be more than one assailant. Disparity of force could be an elderly man or a person that was handicapped and in a wheelchair versus a strong young person. One of the cases that I worked was the Trayvon Martin case. Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. In that particular case, we had disparity of force where Trayvon Martin was about 5'8" and 165 pounds and lean and mean. George Zimmerman was about 5'7" and almost 200 pounds and sort of chubby and completely out of shape. When Trayvon Martin knocked George Zimmerman down onto the sidewalk and started punching him in a front mount position and then started beating his head into the concrete, that was a great example of disparity of force. So don't forget, when we have disparity of force, a lot of times we also have preclusion. And Rob already talked about IMOP. So you see how those things all come together that provide us with a legal defense of using deadly force? During this past hour, we've talked about the use of deadly force and carrying a concealed weapon. We've talked about the standards of proof versus objective versus subjective. We've talked about imminent threats versus potential threats. We've talked about predictive use of force versus reasonable objective use of force. And we've talked about the CCW lifestyle. Don't forget that upon successful completion of this course and test questions that will come from this video and in the PowerPoint presentation, you are just beginning your journey in becoming a responsibly armed private citizen. Remember that this is the beginning of the journey, not the end of the journey. Rob and I and all our instructors and our staff at Street Safe Defense Firearms Training Company encourage you to be continuously involved in our self-defense training programs. That's the best insurance policy that will keep you and your family and loved ones safe on the street. Congratulations on making a well-informed decision to become a responsibly armed citizen, and we wish you the best on your journey of self-protection. I'm Dr. Ron Martinelli with instructor Rob Eggers, wishing you good training.